What a delicious piece of pie. Though I do hope it hasn't been poisoned. Hello, I'm Ally Sherrick and I'm a time tunneler. And because it's getting close to Christmas, I thought it might be fun to talk about feasts and banquets, and in particular, medieval ones. Now, back in the Middle Ages, there were three sorts of people. There were the commoners, ordinary folk, a bit like you and me. Then there were the clergy, and they were people who got their living from the church, so people like priests and monks and bishops and nuns. And then at the top of their tree, there was the nobility, which was all the grand lords and ladies of the land going right up to the king and queen. And the nobility liked to show their power and wealth to everyone else. And they did this through the sorts of houses they lived in, the grand manors and castles, also through the clothes that they wore, like my wonderful shawl here, but also through the feasts and banquets they held to entertain people. So, if you were going to organise a grand medieval banquet, what would you need to think about to be sure to impress your guests? Well, there were a number of things, and I'm going to start off with the way that the room looked, because the room needed to be dressed to impress. So you had to have your trestle tables brought out, your grand top table covered in wonderful tablecloth with lots of hand cloths available for people to wipe their fingers. And if you had very special guests attending, then you might have a dresser, a sort of cupboard set up at the side of the room, covered in your best gold and pewter plate. So these were bowls and dishes and jugs and goblets made of pewter and gold and all polished so that they shone. And once you had decorated the room, well, you also had to think about something called the order of service, which was the order in which things were done, because it was very important to get that right. And all the guests had to wash their hands before they came in to sit at the table. And when they came in, they were organised according to their place in society or their rank. So the lord and his lady and his most important guests would sit at the top table, which was at the top of the room, often up a set of steps. And then lower down, you would have the lesser sort. So they would be organised according to the rank they took, ending at the very back of the room with the most junior members of the group. And once everybody had sat down, then you would need to say grace or prayers to thank God for what was about to be served up to you. And then the signal for everyone to start the eating came from the Lord himself, and he had this ceremonial salt cellar, and he used to take a pinch of salt and sprinkle it, and that was the signal for things to begin. So then, of course, the food was brought out, and it was served in plates, which the servants then spooned the food into these things called trenchers. So they weren't ordinary dinner plates like the one that I've got here. They were actually made often out of stale bread with the middle scooped out, and the food was served directly into the middle of the trencher. Sometimes they could be made of wood as well. And when the first course was served, the Lord got a choice of about 6 dishes, but the further down you were, the less choice you had. So often you only had a choice of 2 dishes. And then the Lord and his guests got a second course, which was brought on after the first course, but everyone else didn't get to enjoy that. The Lord also got to taste desserts and sweetmeats, but again, if you were lower down the pecking order, that wasn't for you, unfortunately. However, everyone did get the chance to drink ale, which was a sort of beer, often made with honey and spices and herbs. And there was also wine, which was usually watered down, and only the Lord and his guests got to choose how much their wine was watered down. So once you'd finished with the business of eating, there were entertainments, and these were usually provided by actors, sometimes known as mummers, who would come in these strange costumes and perform a play. There was also music and sometimes dancing afterwards. And sometimes at the very grandest feasts, the Lord would employ people known as disguisers, sometimes from his staff, and they would be dressed up in a mysterious masked disguise, and they would come on, and everyone would have to try and guess who they were. They sort of disappear mysteriously at the end without saying who they were. And that was always a grand talking point. Another thing that was a grand talking point was this most amazing table decoration called a subtlety. And that was brought out and paraded around the hall and placed on the Lord's table. And it was made out of sculptured sugar, which is a very expensive item, or sometimes pastry. And these things, they may be a bird, or they may be trying to sort of show a scene from a well-known story, and they might have little plaster characters. So these again were great talking points. And at the end of the feast, all the leftover food was collected into baskets and taken outside to the gates of the Lord's property, where it would be given out to the poor people who lived in the surrounding areas. So in this way, the Lord was demonstrating his great generosity. And if you like the sound of those medieval banquets, then you might like to check out this book, Catherine Called Birdie by Karen Cushman. This tells the story of a young girl called Catherine growing up in the Middle Ages in her parents' manor house. And it's all about how her father is trying to get her married off to somebody, but she's not interested. Okay, she wants to go and have fun with her friend Perkin the goat herd and Meg the serving girl. But in amongst all the adventures that Catherine has, trying to avoid being married off, she is also forced to attend many grand banquets. And there are some fantastic descriptions in the book of the sorts of food and entertainments that go on there. Okay, now it's your turn. And for this week's writing challenge, what I'd like you to do is to think about your own grand banquet. Think about where you might hold it, what sort of things you need to do to decorate the room to impress your guests. Who are your guests going to be? Who are you going to invite? And what sorts of food will you have served? Is it going to be things like the great pie, which I was enjoying at the start of this video, which is made with 3 different types of meat mixed up with mince and currants and nuts and spices, and perhaps for pudding, a rose petal pudding, again made with lots of spices and milk and real rose petals? Or is it going to be something completely different? I'll leave that up to you. But one thing I'd like you to add in as a special ingredient is a bit of mystery and danger. And I'm thinking that perhaps there might be somebody trying to poison the lord or lady at the banquet. And perhaps one of those disguises they've employed isn't all that they seem. Okay, what might happen next? That's the question for you. So, happy writing. And now I think I'm going to go and have to have a lie down because I've got a little touch of indigestion. Okay, bye.